Have you ever stopped to think about what you would do if you discovered that the place where you live is about to be destroyed? Imagine waking up and realizing that everything that once seemed solid, wealth, security, pleasures, and achievements, is nothing more than an illusion on the verge of collapse. This is the reality behind the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities that to this day stir mystery, debates, and above all, powerful lessons for our lives. And let me tell you something, this story is not only about the past, but a frightening reflection of the present. Sodom and Gomorrah were not just ordinary cities, they were the center of a fertile region, compared to the very Garden of Eden, a place of abundance and prosperity, where everything seemed within reach of those who lived there. Wealth flowed, feasts were held, and the inhabitants believed they had achieved a perfect life. But in the midst of so much luxury, something was hidden, a silent poison that corroded the soul of those cities, the same moral and spiritual decay that, if we look closely, is also present in today's world. And here is the crucial point. Sodom and Gomorrah were not destroyed merely by a divine whim or by an exaggerated legend. They became an eternal symbol of what happens when humanity decides to turn its back on God, to give in to pride, injustice, and idolatry, believing it can live without limits. And if you think this is just an ancient story, wait until you realize how many similarities exist between those days and the times we live in now. The biblical account transports us to an intense scene. Abraham, the patriarch, receives from God the revelation that those cities were about to be judged. But in a gesture of compassion, he intercedes, asking for mercy. Abraham argues, what if there are 50 righteous? What if there are 40? What if there are 10? The request is simple. Save the city if there were at least a handful of faithful people. The result? Not even 10 righteous were found. This scene already shows us something grand. God's patience in the face of human wickedness has a limit. He is just, but also merciful. And when the cry of the innocent becomes too loud, judgment is inevitable. Now, think with me. How many times have you looked around and noticed injustice, violence, and corruption taking over society? How many times have you felt that evil seemed to have become normal, accepted, even celebrated? That was exactly what happened in Sodom. The problem was not only the sin itself, but the pride with which it was practiced. The inhabitants not only sinned, they boasted out their sins, turned evil into a lifestyle, and mocked everything that was sacred. And here is the first great lesson. When error ceases to be the exception and becomes the rule, when sin is no longer hidden, but is celebrated, it is a sign that decay has reached its deepest point. That was the scenario of Sodom, a place where compassion had been erased, where injustice was routine, and where violence against the weakest was practiced without remorse.
But the Bible does not recount this story just to shock us with the destruction of those cities. It brings a direct warning to me and to you. After all, is the world we live in today really that different? Don't we see every day the growth of indifference, the reckless pursuit of pleasure, the worship of money, and the idolatry of appearance? Aren't we constantly bombarded by messages that push us toward a superficial lifestyle where God seems increasingly distant? If you think that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is miles away from our reality, look again. What led to the ruin of those cities was not just an isolated sin, but a series of choices that formed an entire culture of degradation. Evil, idolatry, pride, distorted sexuality, laziness, and indifference toward others were the trademarks of Sodom and Gomorrah. And when we look at today's world, it is not difficult to see echoes of that same mentality. Now pay attention, because here comes the central point. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not just a catastrophe to be recorded in books. It was a message for all future generations, a reminder that every time humanity abandons spiritual values and gives in to the arrogance of living without God, the result is always the same: chaos, suffering, and inevitably, judgment. And this is where I want to challenge you, not just to watch this video as if it were another Bible story, but to truly dive into this narrative and reflect on what it means for your life today. To what extent have you allowed yourself to be influenced by the culture around you? Which areas of your life are at risk of resembling Sodom? This is the kind of provocation that can turn this video into something far greater than mere knowledge. It's about change, reflection, and decision. While Abraham cried out for mercy, God was still looking for a reason to spare those cities. But the silence of the righteous was deafening. And that's another striking detail. Evil thrives not only when the wicked act, but also when the righteous remain silent. That means staying neutral in the face of injustice is in a way agreeing with it. And how many times have we also remained silent? Sodom and Gomorrah were not destroyed by chance. Their downfall was the inevitable consequence of a way of life that completely rejected goodness and truth. And if you already feel that this message is making you reflect, I want you to stay with me until the end, because we are still going to explore in detail each of the sins that marked those cities and how they remain alive today. And more than that, we will understand how this story can become a guide for facing the spiritual and moral challenges that you and I encounter every day. So here's the challenge. Don't leave this video until the end. Stay with me until the very last word, and you will discover truths that may open your eyes in a way you've never imagined before. And when we reach the end, I want to hear your opinion. What did this story speak to your heart? Which areas of your life do you feel need to change? And how do you believe we can live differently from the culture that surrounds us?
This is only the first part of the journey. Get ready, because now we are going to dive even deeper into what really happened in Sodom and Gomorrah and the secrets that this story hides. And if in the first part we understood the historical and spiritual background of Sodom and Gomorrah, now it is time to delve into the details that reveal why these cities became an eternal symbol of what happens when a society completely rejects the ways of God. What we are about to see is not just a list of isolated sins, but a portrait of a lifestyle that led to ruin. And believe me, that portrait is more current than you might imagine. The first trait that marked Sodom was rampant wickedness. We are not talking about common mistakes or occasional missteps, but about a corruption that had taken over the culture as a whole. Violence was not the exception, it was the rule. Injustice was not fought, it was accepted as part of everyday life. When a society normalizes oppression, exploitation, and contempt for life, it digs the very pit into which it will fall. And this is not only about the past. Just look at today's news, where so many innocent people suffer at the hands of unjust systems and hardened hearts. The outcry that rose from the streets of Sodom still echoes in the cries of pain and injustice we see in today's world. Another deep trait was idolatry. Many think that idolatry is only about bowing before images, but the truth is that idolatry is replacing God with anything that takes his place in our lives. In Sodom, the worship of pleasure, power, and wealth replaced devotion to the Creator. And here comes the uncomfortable question. How many times do we do the same? How many times do we place our dreams, our careers, our possessions, or even our relationships above our communion with God? Modern idolatry may not have stone statues, but it reveals itself in phone screens, in symbols of status, and in the relentless pursuit of approval. It is precisely this substitution of God that silently corrodes the human heart. The third trait was distorted sexuality. The biblical narrative clearly shows that the inhabitants of Sodom had completely lost their sense of the sacred in intimacy.
The visit of the angels to Lot's house is one of the most shocking passages. Men of the city demanding that he hand over the visitors to be abused. This behavior was not only immoral, but revealed a total absence of respect for human dignity. When intimacy, which should be an expression of love and commitment, turns into violence, promiscuity, and a mere object of pleasure, the result is devastating. And once again, look around. How often do we see that same emptiness of meaning in today's relationships, where the trivialization of the body and the distancing from the divine purpose generate confusion, pain, and loneliness? But that was not all. Ezekiel gives us a surprising revelation. Sodom was also condemned because of idleness and indifference. They had plenty of bread, prosperity, and tranquility, but they did not stretch out their hands to the needy. In other words, excess made them selfish. They became comfortable in an easy life and forgot about their neighbor. And here is another powerful reflection. How often in the midst of abundance do we forget to share, to help, to care? Complacency can be just as destructive as the most visible sins. A society that closes its eyes to those in need is already in the process of collapse.
And finally, perhaps the most destructive sin of all, pride. Pride not only leads someone to err, but makes them celebrate that error and refuse to change. The inhabitants of Sodom did not merely live in sin, they flaunted it as a banner of rebellion against God. Isaiah describes that they proclaimed their sin like Sodom, without hiding it. This is the essence of pride, turning wrongdoing into a reason for glory, rejecting any possibility of repentance. And here lies the connection with our reality. We live in a time when what is wrong is often celebrated as right, where the inversion of values becomes a cause for applause, and those who dare to question it are seen as outdated. All of this culminated in a point of no return. God sent the angels to rescue Lot and his family, showing that even in the midst of judgment, there is always room for mercy. But the command was clear: leave without looking back. This instruction is full of symbolism, because many times, even when God calls us to a new life, we have the tendency to look back, to feel nostalgic for what was left behind, to not fully let go of what binds us. Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt for that very reason. She could not detach herself from the past. And here's another provocation. How many times do we also look back, trying to hold on to a life that God has already told us to leave? How many times do we insist on keeping habits, relationships, or practices that we know draw us away from Him? The message is clear. Whoever desires to live the new must be willing to let go of the old without looking back. The ending is striking. Fire and sulfur fell from the sky, and in an instant, Sodom and Gomorrah ceased to exist. Everything that once seemed solid, houses, wealth, status, fame, turned to ashes before the power of God. What remains is not just the image of destruction, but the reminder that there is no true prosperity without justice, humility, and the presence of God. And now I turn to you. When you look at this story, can you see how many similarities there are between Sodom and our time? Corruption, violence, idolatry, the trivialization of intimacy, pride and sin, indifference toward the suffering of others. Doesn't all of this sound familiar? And that's why this message is not just about the past, but about the present. It's a warning, but also an invitation. The warning is clear. When a society insists on living far from God, sooner or later it faces the consequences. But the invitation is even more powerful. It is possible to choose a different path. It is possible to resist the culture of the time and live in communion with God, even if everything around us moves in the opposite direction. The life of Lot shows that God still extends His hand to those who decide to trust in Him. And here's the payoff I want to leave you with. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just about destruction, but about opportunity. It's about the chance to look at our own lives, identify the points that need to change, and make decisions today before it's too late. It's about understanding that God continues to be just, but also merciful, and that He still hears the cry of those who rise against injustice and seek to live in integrity. And if you've made it this far, I want to give you one final challenge. Reflect on what this story spoke to you. Which areas of your life are at risk of resembling Sodom? In what ways do you need to stop looking back and start moving forward, trusting in God?
Write your thoughts in the comments, share your experience, and let's together build a community that stands on truth and seeks to live differently from the corrupted culture around us. If this message made sense to you, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this today. Because just as the cry of Sodom reached God, the cry for justice and transformation is still alive, and we can be the answer for a world that urgently needs hope. May God bless your life and give you the strength not to look back, but to move forward firmly on the path that leads to true life.